This week, our topic is the slasher film, probably one of the most popular subgenres of horror. Now, they're also called teeny kill flicks, and this is because of the fact that movies are for teenagers most of the time. That's the target audience, and also has a lot of teenagers usually being killed off systematically by a killer in a mask, i.e. poorly characterized, because we never really get to know the killer. The hero in these films is usually what we refer to as the final girl. Occasionally you have male heroes, but most of the time in slasher films, your hero, or at least the person who makes it through the film for the longest period of time, because occasionally they don't actually survive, is going to be a girl, and that's referred to as the final girl, mainly meaning she's the last person standing. Most of the time she's going to be kind of prudish, sometimes, quasi-virginal in some cases, sexually reluctant, and also, occasionally, and the book makes a little bit too much of this, she's going to be kind of tomboyish and kind of asexually resourceful, simply because of the fact in the movie Hell Night, our final girl manages to hotwire a car. But most of the time, your final girl is still going to be pretty girly. Now, these films use a lot of subjective camera work, meaning it's the point of view of a character, and most of the time it's going to be the point of view of the killer. And that means the killer is going to see the victim. That's what you, the audience, sees, but the victim is going to be unaware of who the killer is, or they might see the killer, but you, the audience, isn't. Because when you finally figure out who the killer is, it's usually not that exciting. It's usually just a person in a mask, but you want to hold off on figuring out who that is until the end of the film, unlike in Blood Feast, where we figured out who the killer was immediately. There's common use of the startle effect, and this means that there are things that jump out at you all of a sudden to try to scare you. Oftentimes it'll set you up for an even bigger scare later on. So sometimes you have the red herring startle effect as well. You might have noticed that the killers are often very slow. They walk incredibly slowly, and then we have like an incredibly fit teenager running as fast as they can. They always seem to trip over a rock and get caught at the last minute. In a way, this is comical, but it's also a little more threatening and a little scarier because it seems like no matter what you do, you can't get away from this killer. Some good examples of this are Halloween, which a lot of people credit with starting the whole slasher film cycle off. Friday the 13th, which is what we're watching this week, from 1980. That's one of the next seminal works. Also Funhouse from 1981, which is one of my personal favorites because I remember seeing that in the theaters when it came out when I was a little kid and probably shouldn't have been let into the theater. Now, most slasher films are going to have sequels. That's kind of the whole point of a slasher film. You don't really kill off the killer. The killer comes back, and then the final girl or the new final hero has to kill the killer again, and it gets a little bit harder every time. And as you progress in a slasher film cycle, usually the body count has to go up. So in Halloween, only 5 people die. But in Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter, we have 13 people who end up dying in that. So in each sequel, you have to kill off more people. It makes things more exciting. You kill them off in new ways. I guess it's the way to keep the franchise kind of fresh. Some of the later slasher films have immortal or supernatural killers. Freddy Krueger is actually supernatural, so you can't really kill him. He's only in people's dreams. That's kind of a brilliant creation there. And then we have Jason from the Friday the 13th series, because he gets killed repeatedly. Actually, he gets killed in Friday the 13th, the final chapter, but they manage to somehow resurrect him numerous times and send him into space and Manhattan, and then have him fight Freddy Krueger later on. So I guess that's a way to keep having sequels. Have them be immortal. The final girl also becomes a little more powerful to combat those supernatural powers that the killers have. So they occasionally are given kung fu powers, or are good with swords, or sometimes they can blow things up with their minds and things like that. And then once again, that's to make the franchises a little more fresh and exciting, although they get a little bit more ridiculous as time goes on. So throughout the 80s, the slasher subgenre was king. By the time we get to the early 90s, it had pretty much petered out. And it pretty much charted the same rise and fall as glam metal, if anyone's old enough to remember that, which I doubt. So the new wave of slasher films began in the mid-90s with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is kind of a rehash of Nightmare on Elm Street. And then, of course, we get the Scream cycle as well. And this is probably where a lot of you probably came into horror films and slasher films. And they became immensely popular once again. Now, most of these films, what differentiates them from the earlier slasher films, and it's one of the reasons why the book refers to them as postmodern slasher films, is that the characters in these films know they're in a slasher film. They know the rules, and, well, it still doesn't help them very much. They still end up dying. So the Scream series is a good example of that. So our film for this week is Friday the 13th from 1980, directed by Sean S. Cunningham, who directed a few other horror films as well. And Halloween is the one that kind of kicked things off, but Friday the 13th is the next big one that people tend to remember. And it's pretty formulaic, but it's a good formula, and that's one of the reasons why slasher films were pretty popular. So you have a group of teenagers. They show up, in this case, at a summer camp, but they might show up some other place that they're probably not supposed to. In this case, the summer camp has a history of death, and they get picked off one by one by a mysterious killer. As I said, you don't want to know the killer's identity until the end of the film, and this killer has some kind of attachment to the summer camp or place that the campers shouldn't be, and we get all kinds of mayhem, excitement, a little bit of brief nudity, and that kind of thing as well. That's what slasher films are all about. One of the great things about this particular film is that our killer isn't Jason, which most of you think of Friday the 13th, you think of Jason and his hockey mask, which he didn't actually get until Part 3. In Part 2, he actually has a gunny sack on his head. But he isn't actually the killer in this film, so you get a little bit of a different flavor in this film. And what's great about this film is that, I don't want to spoil it, but at the end of the film, it sets it up perfectly for a sequel. And it's not like we have a killer who gets shot like 12 times and then gets up and walks away. It's perfectly set up for that, so that's pretty cool. And then, of course, we get 12 sequels after this. So, enjoy, and I will keep working on getting lectures to you folks, so I apologize for not having one for last week. Good luck. Bye.